The Tsar's last Armada, Voyage of the Damned. The year 1900 foreshadows over an empire. The winter of 1904 hung over Europe like a gray curtain. Across the frozen palaces of St. Petersburg, the lamps of the Russian Empire still burned. But behind their glow, there was unease. Factories trembled with strikes. Peasants whispered of hunger. And far away in the east, a small island nation had challenged the Tsar's colossal power. In the gilded halls of the Winter Palace, Nicholas II listened as his ministers spoke of the war with Japan. They promised victory. They promised that the strength of Russia, the greatest land empire the world had ever known, would crush any Asian pretender. Yet telegrams from Manchuria told another story. Defeat after defeat, lines broken, soldiers starving in snow. At Port Arthur, once the pride of the Tsar's Pacific ambitions, the first Pacific Fleet lay wrapped under Japanese guns. Every week new shells fell on its harbor, and every week the reports grew darker. The empire's prestige, built on centuries of expansion and conquest, was sinking with each shattered ship. Nicholas paced beneath the portraits of his ancestors, feeling the weight of Romanov eyes. To lose the Pacific was to lose more than territory. It was to lose faith in the divine order that had crowned his family for 300 years. His generals urged him to act. His admirals whispered of a second fleet, the reserves at Kronstadt and Libau still untouched by war. Send them east, they said. Send them to restore the empire's honor. And so a decision was made that would shape history. The Tsar would send his Baltic Fleet on a journey no navy had attempted before. 18,000 miles, from the cold waters of the Baltic Sea to the far Pacific. It would be called the Second Pacific Squadron. It would sail to avenge Port Arthur and remind the world that Russia remained a giant. But beneath the ceremony and prayers, the new fleet was a machine built from desperation. In the shipyards of the Baltic, the Buridano-class battleships stood gleaming but untested. Their engines rattled, their armor still smelled of paint, and their crews, peasants drawn from farms and factories, had never seen the open ocean. They were promised glory. What awaited them was something else entirely. At the center of it all stood Admiral Inoversification, a man both brilliant and haunted. He was a master of gunnery, precise and disciplined, yet tormented by doubt. He knew the truth. His fleet was a patchwork of old and new, of faith and fear. Still, when the Tsar's order came, he bowed and said the only word a loyal servant could: yes. Outside the frozen harbor of Libau, the sea groaned under sheets of ice. Workers hammered, engines coughed, coldest rose like smoke from 1,000 shovels. The sailors loaded shells. They hoped never to fire and whispered prayers they barely believed. Their breath froze in the wind. Somewhere deep in the hull of each ship, the sound of boilers echoed like a heartbeat. On the morning of departure, priests blessed the fleet. Incense curled over gun barrels. Choirs sang hymns that vanished into fog. The brass bands played the anthem of the Tsar. Families waved from the piers, their voices lost in the roar of engines. And slowly, painfully, the ships began to move. Steam hissed. Anchors rose. The gray water parted before them, and the last great armada of Imperial Russia slipped into the mist. Behind it, the Empire's frozen heart kept beating slow, uncertain, but proud. Not aboard those ships could know that they were sailing not toward victory, but into legend, into madness, and into the long night from which few would ever return. The fleet steamed south into open water, leaving behind the chill fog of the North Sea and the outrage it had caused. The men spoke little of the Dogger Bank disaster. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, it was a curse. The British watched them from a distance now, gray silhouettes on the horizon, patient and silent. Rozevsky's orders were clear: sail to the Far East at all costs. But the Suez Canal was closed to him. Britain, still seething, had forbidden Russian warships to pass through. That left only one path: the long way around Africa, a voyage of nearly 18,000 miles. In late October, the Armada turned toward the Atlantic. The air grew warmer, the sea broader, but the burden heavier. The engines roared day and night, eating coal faster than it could be replaced. Every man became a stoker. Every breath was filled with soot. The decks were black, the men blacker still. Fuel was life. International law forbade belligerent ships from coaling in neutral ports, so the Russians relied on a fleet of German colliers that met them in secret anchorages. The transfers were agony. Under the tropical sun, sailors shoveled coal for 12, sometimes 16 hours straight. Their uniforms turned to rags, their skin cracked and bled from salt and sweat. Hunger soon followed. The meat spoiled in the heat, bread molded within days, and water grew thick with rust. Sickness spread through the lower decks: dysentery, fever, the slow poison of exhaustion. The doctors did what they could, but medicine ran out long before hope did. Rzewstycki maintained order through fear. He paced the flagship with the same relentless step, his face carved from stone. Officers who failed him were berated before the crew. One captain, accused of cowardice, was stripped of his command on the spot. The admiral's temper was legend, but it was also the only force holding the fleet together. Yet even he could not command the sea. Storms rose off the coast of Africa, tearing at the ships with walls of water. Waves crashed over the decks, flooding the gun ports. Men clung to ropes as the ships rolled until their masts nearly touched the sea. In one storm, a transport carrying ammunition was struck by lightning. The flash lit the horizon like the end of the world. When the fleet reached the equator, the air became a furnace. The decks shimmered with heat, and the nights offered no relief. To breathe below deck was to swallow steam. The sailors slept on the open decks despite the risk of falling overboard. One man did, vanishing into the black water without a cry. His shipmates stared after him, too weak to mourn. Amid this misery, absurdity flourished. In the ports of the western coast, the sailors traded trinkets for monkeys, parrots, even snakes. Someone acquired a crocodile, which took up residence in the boiler room of a transport ship. When it escaped one night, the sailors swore the devil himself had come to claim the fleet. In the admiral's log, the handwriting grew harder to read. "The men are losing faith," he wrote. "They work as machines, not as souls. We have become our own prison." By the time the fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope, many ships were half crippled. Boilers leaked, guns corroded, and the constant motion had loosened every bolt. They limped onward, haunted by fatigue. Off the coast of Madagascar, a messenger ship brought news that froze every heart. Port Arthur had fallen. The fortress they had come to save was gone. The First Pacific Fleet Russia's pride lay in ruins. For a long time, no orders came from the flagship. The men waited in silence, listening to the sea slap against the hull. When Rzewstycki finally appeared on deck, his face was pale as ash. He looked eastward and said quietly, "We will continue." No one cheered. No one spoke. The engines started again, grinding out their rhythm like a death march. The voyage had lost its purpose, but it went on because the Tsar demanded it, and because there was nowhere else to go. The fleet reached Madagascar in February 1905. The long voyage around Africa had drained both men and machines, and the island's calm harbor at last offered stillness. But peace was an illusion. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with insects, and the smell of rot hung over every deck. They anchored in the Bay of Nosy Be, a patch of blue water ringed by jungle. For the first time in months, the ship's worst island, men slept where they fell, sprawled across decks and gangways. Others collapsed in the shade, their faces blackened with coal dust. The officers tried to keep order, but even discipline melted under the tropical sun. The fleet was stranded, supplies were low, and no one knew what to do next. Messages from St. Petersburg took weeks to arrive, and when they did, they carried only confusion. The Tsar's ministers argued among themselves. Some demanded the fleet press onto the Pacific. Others begged Rzewstycki to wait for reinforcements. In the meantime, the men waited, and waiting was its own kind of torture. Disease moved through the ships like fire through dry grass. Malaria, dysentery, and fever claimed dozens each week. The ship doctors tore sheets into bandages and prayed they would hold. Bodies were buried at sea, each wrapped in canvas and weighted with coal. The sound of the splash became a daily ritual. Morale sank into delirium. To distract themselves, sailors built crude stages on deck, performing comedies and hymns before hollow-eyed audiences. Some drank industrial alcohol mixed with fruit juice. Others wandered the decks at night, whispering that they could hear the ocean calling their names. Rzewski kept to his cabin, poring over maps and telegrams. His temper had cooled into a grim silence. His officers came to fear that silence more than his rage. One night, his aide found him staring at the chart of the Pacific, the ink smudged where his hand had rested too long. "We are already ghosts," he said, when a mail steamer arrived from Europe. It brought news that shattered what little spirit remained. Port Arthur had fallen weeks earlier. The first Pacific Fleet was gone. The fortress the Tsar had sworn to relieve no longer existed. The men gathered on deck to hear the announcement. No one spoke. Some crossed themselves, others spat into the sea. The admiral's log for that day contained only 5 words: "The mission no longer exists." Yet even then, they could not turn back. Orders came from St. Petersburg, continue to the Far East. The Tsar's pride would not allow retreat. Rzewski read the message aloud in the wardroom, his voice flat. "We go on," he said, "for Russia." The officers exchanged glances but said nothing. In truth, the fleet had become a floating purgatory, a prison of steel and heat, adrift between obedience and madness. As weeks turned into months, absurd stories circulated. A parrot aboard the flagship wanted to curse in Russian and was treated as an omen. A crocodile, kept as a mascot, escaped into the water, prompting half the crew to dive after it. The sailors began to tattoo icons of saints on their arms, believing it would shield them from fire. The local Malagasy traders watched the spectacle with curiosity. They sold fruit, goats, and palm wine to the Russians, who paid in coins, trinkets, or bullets. The jumble around the bay echoed with laughter, curses, and the clang of hammers as the ships were patched for the 1000th time. In April, Rzewski received word that reinforcements were sailing to meet him, the so-called Third Pacific Squadron, a ragtag collection of old cruisers and transports. Their arrival only deepened his despair. The new ships were slower, weaker, and commanded by officers he despised. Still, he accepted them. He had no choice. The monsoon season arrived, and with it came endless rain. The fleet became a rusting archipelago of misery. Steam rose from the decks, and lightning split the sky. Some men swore they saw faces in the clouds. Others began to dream of home and woke crying. When at last the skies cleared, Rzewski gave the order to weigh anchor. "We sail east," he said simply. No one asked why. The engines rumbled back to life, and the fleet turned its bows toward the unknown. Behind them, Madagascar shimmered in the morning light, a mirage fading into distance. The purgatory was over. The final act had begun. The fleet left Madagascar under a sky of burning blue. The sea was calm, the horizon endless, but the air itself seemed heavy with foreboding. Every man aboard knew the truth now. They were sailing not to victory but to their deaths. Yet still they went, because an empire had ordered it. The ships moved eastward into long lines, smoke trailing behind them like feral veils. Each morning began with the same routine inspection. Drill, the grinding rhythm of the engines. Each night ended with the same silence. The men no longer sang. Even the parrots had stopped cursing. In the wardrooms, the officers read what little news reached them. Revolution was stirring in Russia. Strikes, riots, shooting, signs that the homeland itself was beginning to fracture. The men whispered that they were the last servants of a dying empire, forgotten by all except the sea. By early May, the fleet reached the coast of Indochina. There, in the sheltered waters of Cam Bay, they met the reinforcements from the 3rd Pacific Squadron. The newcomers were a pitiful sight, old cruisers belching smoke, transports barely afloat. Rzewski stared at them from the bridge of the Suvarow and felt despair settle in his chest like lead. His fleet, already crippled, was now burdened by even greater weakness. He called a meeting of his captains aboard the flagship. They gathered around the chart table, the air thick with heat and resentment. "We have come too far to turn back," he said. "The Tsar demands that we reach Vladivostok." No one replied. A few stared at their boots. Others watched the admiral with hollow eyes. He continued, his voice steady but empty. "Our duty is to sail. The rest," he looked toward the map of Japan pinned to the wall, "is in God's hands. The fleet spent 2 weeks in Cam Ranh Bay, in repairing what could still be repaired. The sailors bartered with local fishermen for rice and fruit. Tropical rains fell every afternoon, washing the decks but not the despair. Each evening, the men gathered along the rails to watch the sun sink into the sea, as if trying to memorize its warmth before it was gone forever. When the order to depart came, it felt like a death sentence. The engines roared, and the Armada turned north toward the South China Sea. The waters there were calm, but the tension was not. At night, the lookouts thought they saw shadows moving on the horizon. Japanese scouts, perhaps, or ghosts. The fleet's radio operators caught fragments of signals they could not decode. The enemy was near, though unseen. Russo-Japanese's health began to fail. His headaches grew unbearable, his temper unpredictable. He spent hours alone in his cabin, surrounded by maps and half-written orders. His staff avoided him when they could. "The Admiral is burning out," one officer whispered. "Soon he will burn us all." By the time they reached the waters off Formosa, the crews were barely functioning. The endless heat had returned, turning the steel decks into ovens. Water was rationed, tempers snapped over trifles. 2 sailors fought with knives over a tin of meat. On another ship, a gunner threw himself overboard without warning. Yet, even in this despair, there were moments of strange beauty. One night, as the fleet crossed the Luzon Strait, the sea glowed with blue fire. The wakes of the ships shimmered with bioluminescence, as if the water itself was alive. The men leaned over the rails in silence, mesmerized. For a fleeting moment, they forgot where they were going. On the morning of May 25th, a mist rose over the horizon. Beyond it lay the Korean Strait in Japan. The men sharpened their bayonets, cleaned their guns, and wrote their last letters home. Some sealed them in bottles, to be thrown into the sea if fate allowed. In his cabin, Russo-Japanese sat alone, staring at the clock. Every tick sounded like the toll of a bell. He opened his logbook and wrote, "We have entered the shadow of destiny." Then he closed it and gave the order that would seal the fate of the Tsar's last armada. Prepare for battle. The morning of May 27th, 1905 dawned pale and cold. A gray mist clung to the surface of the sea, and the Russian fleet crept northward through the Korean Strait. The water was calm, the wind faint, yet every man felt the stillness as an omen. At 4:45, aboard the hospital ship Ural, a lookout saw a shape on the horizon, a small cruiser, its funnels black against the lightning sky. Believing it to be friendly, the crew signaled in Russian code, but the ship did not respond. It was the Japanese scout Shin Otomaru, and the signal had given away everything. By mid-morning, Admiral Haihyu Road Ogo knew the Russians' position, course and speed. On his flagship Mikasa, he raised the Z flag. The fate of the Empire depends upon this action. Let every man do his utmost. The Japanese fleet moved like a blade through fog, swift and silent. Its gunners were rested, its ships well-trained and freshly supplied. The Russians, weary from their half-year voyage, barely held formation. Many of their gunners had never fired live ammunition. The decks were slick with dew and coal dust. At 140 p.m, lookout aboard Suvorov shouted, "Enemy sighted." The fog parted just enough to reveal a line of Japanese battleships crossing their path, perfectly positioned to deliver a broadside. Russo-Japanese gave the order, "Open fire." The Russian guns thundered, the sound rolling across the strait like the crack of the world splitting open. But their aim was wild. The shells fell short or splashed harmlessly against the sea. The Japanese response came moments later, precise, devastating, unrelenting. High explosive shells rained down on the Suvorov. The first struck the bridge, tearing through steel and menelite. Another set the signal deck ablaze. Within minutes, flames engulfed the flagship. Russo-Japanese, struck in the head by shrapnel, was carried below, blood staining his uniform. Command passed into chaos. The rest of the fleet faltered. The Alexander II tried to turn, only to collide with the cruiser. The Borodino continued to fire blindly, its gunners choking on smoke. Japanese shells exploded on impact, sending showers of steel fragments that ripped through flesh and timber. One struck the forward magazine of the OS Al Yabaye. A moment later, The ship split into and sank with nearly all hands. By 3 o'clock, the sea was a furnace. Black smoke blotted out the sun. Ships burned from bow to stern, their hulls glowing red beneath the paint. Men leapt into the water, their uniforms on fire. Oil spread across the surface, igniting in streaks of orange and blue. From the distance, the battlefield looked less like an ocean than a continent of flame. On the Mikasa, Togo stood calm and watchful. He adjusted his course to maintain perfect range, his ships executing their maneuvers with clockwork precision. His voice over the signal tubes was steady. Keep your distance. Let the enemy burn. By dusk, the Subaru was dead in the water. Japanese destroyers moved in, launching torpedoes that struck her hull one after another. The ship rolled, then vanished beneath the waves. Of her crew, nearly all perished. Rzewski, unconscious, was pulled from the wreckage by a torpedo boat hours later, not even aware he had lost his fleet. Night fell, but the battle did not end. Japanese torpedo boats prowled the darkness, their wakes glowing with phosphorescence. They struck again and again, tearing holes in crippled Russian ships. Explosions flared across the horizon like distant storms. The screams of the dying mingled with the hiss of steam and the crack of gunfire. By dawn, May 28th, it was over. The Borodino had exploded and sunk, taking more than 800 men with her. The Alexander II capsized. The Oral, once a hospital ship, was captured. Only a few vessels managed to flee north. Of the 40 ships that had left Libo, 21 were sunk, 7 captured, and the rest scattered or interned. More than 12,000 men were dead or prisoners. The Japanese lost only 3 small torpedo boats. As the sun rose over the smoking sea, the survivors clung to wreckage, watching the enemy's flags flutter in the morning light. The sea that had carried them halfway around the world had finally claimed them. For Russia, the age of empires was ending. For Japan, a new one was just beginning. The morning after the battle was still and colorless. The sea that had burned the day before now lay smooth and empty, strewn only with wreckage planks, bodies, lifeboats drifting without purpose. Seagulls circled above, crying as if to announce the end of an age. From the survivors' boats, the smoke of the Japanese ships could be seen on the horizon. They did not fire anymore. The enemy had no need to. Victory was complete. Admiral Rzewski regained consciousness in a Japanese hospital ship. His head was bandaged, his eyes dull and unfocused. When he learned the truth that his fleet no longer existed, he closed his eyes again and said nothing. In that silence, the weight of an empire seemed to rest on his shoulders. He was later brought before Admiral Togo. The meeting was brief. The Japanese commander saluted his defeated foe and said simply, "You fought bravely." Rzewski bowed his head. "I fought poorly," he replied. In the weeks that followed, the surviving Russian ships limped into ports across Asia. Some surrendered at sea, others sought internment in neutral harbors. A few reached Vladivostok, battered and half dead. The men who stepped ashore were no longer sailors, they were ghosts. News of the disaster reached St. Petersburg like a thunderclap. The Tsar's ministers tried to soften the reports, but the truth could not be hidden. 20,000 men lost, the pride of the Imperial Navy destroyed, the myth of Russia's invincibility shattered. Crowds gathered in the streets, shouting for reform, for bread, for change. Soldiers fired into the mobs. The 1905 revolution had begun. In the palace, Nicholas II received the news with an expressionless calm. "It is God's will," he murmured. But even he must have known that divine favor had departed. The empire that stretched from Poland to the Pacific had been humiliated by an island smaller than Siberia. The peace that followed was signed far from the battlefield in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, under the mediation of President Theodore Roosevelt. The treaty ended the war, but not the humiliation. Russia ceded its claims in Manchurian half of Sakhalin Island. Japan emerged as the new power of the Pacific. For Rzewski, the return home was a slow descent into obscurity. He was court-martialed but spared punishment. His name already a curse in the Navy he had once commanded. In his final years, he refused all interviews, speaking little of the voyage. When he died in 1909, the newspapers barely noticed. Yet history did not forget him, or the Armada he led to ruin. The voyage of the Second Pacific Squadron became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Imperial Russia. Pride without preparation, command without understanding, obedience without faith. In the decades that followed, historians would marvel at the absurdity of it all. 18,000 miles of sea crossed for nothing. A fleet destroyed without landing a single decisive blow. A nation humbled before the world. But for the men who had lived it, there was no irony, only exhaustion. They had obeyed orders, served their Tsar, and been abandoned to the deep. The Battle of Tsushima changed more than the map of Asia, it changed the balance of the modern world. It proved that industrial might and discipline could triumph over size and heritage. It announced the arrival of a new century, one ruled not by emperors, but by machines, strategy, and speed. And so the Tsar's last armada passed into legend. The wrecks rusted beneath the sea, their guns silent, their flags long dissolved. The ocean that had devoured them became their graven, their monument. Even now, when the waters of the Tsushima Strait are calm, fishermen say they sometimes hear echoes beneath their hulls, the faint clang of metal, the whisper of engines long dead, and a voice carried through the depths, "We are still sailing."